Hey guys, welcome back to Splints and Whiskey. Sam Patrick here, today with Paul Strauss from lovely Los Angeles. Before we jump into the episode, we're going to talk about our sponsor. So again,
Splints and whiskey.
brought to you by Life Autonomous Care Consultants. If you need any medical supplies, training simulations, or training supplies, go ahead and check them out. LACCINC.com. Again, that's Life Autonomous Care Consultants. And they are a great clearinghouse for any of your medical supplies or training needs. All right, well, so today we have Mr. Paul Strauss that has quite the impressive resume. I'll not go through it verbatim because that'll take me about 12 hours. But Paul is calling in from LA, and I'm going to kick it over to you, good sir, to introduce yourself.
Okay, so I'm a doc. Been an anesthesiologist for about 30 years now. Originally from New York, now in Los Angeles. I've been working at some major institutions for the last 30 years. Right now, I'm working at probably one of the busiest trauma centers in the United States as an anesthesiologist, dealing with everything that you see pre-hospital. I deal with it from the emergency room up to the operating room.
Oh, very cool. Um, that's a very good service level introduction. Like Paul, it's going to sell himself short a little bit, so I'll help fleece out the data. You're also a reserve officer in LAPD.
Yeah.
You're running a multitude of initiatives you're working on. You're kind of a major player in the TAC Med training space on the West Coast. So let's go. Like I had to chuckle with your resume because you have all your LE stuff, law enforcement stuff up front, and then like on the end, here's the fact that you've been a practicing anesthesiologist for 30 years.
Yeah.
So how did you get from obviously doing medicine? Like what got you into the chasing, basically getting your feet into the law enforcement realm, because it's kind of abnormal, not abnormal, I should say.
I don't think it's abnormal.
No, it's not
So
abnormal.
I went from doc world to cop world simply. I started taking some firearms training with a company out here in Los Angeles. Essentially, it was LAPD SWAT at the time.
Hmm.
ITTS, great guys. I did their TAC Med class, and when I'm sitting in the class, realizing that these are the things I do every day as an anesthesiologist, and these guys are great. I mean, these guys are great. So I said I want to be a reserve officer. So I'm basically on patrol in Hollywood Division, like at least once a week.
Right.
Pretty active. And then in terms of the tactical side, I got my hands into it. I had the opportunity to become medical director of a private security company that takes veterans coming out of the service and gives them experience and training in personal security services and executive protection. And I basically every 5 weeks is teaching the TAC Med classes to them as part of their job.
Right on. So yeah, we were talking about it a little bit before the interview. So can you explain like how you run your TAC Med class? Like how long is it? What's kind of the content you focus on?
Okay, so first, let me give you the goal of TAC Med, because unfortunately, I think some of the entities that teach it, it's going in, stopping the threat, and putting tourniquets on. But it's more than that. It's integrating and prioritizing, stopping the killing and stopping the dying. We've learned a lot of things from different, unfortunately, horrible active shooter incidents. But you know what the main lesson in Uvalde was is that you have to initiate stopping the threat early on in the evolution so you can initiate stopping the dying,
Yes.
rendering aid. That's the message.
Yeah, and that's like my background is say very similar. Granted, I was military, but we also like I did a lot of work in the civil space while I was in the military, and that was always my emphasis. Like, hey, like it's threat awareness, threat analysis, and like what are you doing to take steps to reduce the threat. So along those lines, like with the people you're working with, like executive protection, like I've done some work in that as well. Your work with law enforcement, like what are some of your techniques to get these guys to think about threat in like the full spectrum 3D version, 4D version, honestly, of what threat can be?
Well, here's the thing. You can teach people how to put tourniquets on chest seals, but unless you put them in some type of scenario with role players, they'll never get it. Because the things that allows you to role players is two things. Triage, the triage of different injuries after you stop the threat, and then getting the injured to a higher level of care.
Hmm.
We stop that, but in the real world, if you don't get them to the hospital and if necessary on an operating room table, you're not really doing the best thing you can to save their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of those, the classic, you listen to, you know, the pre-hospital medical system in the U.S., like the whole, we have the mantra when we're doing EMT training, do you stand, play, or load and go? And like almost anything in a threat space, like a casualty caused by a high threat or high kinetic environment, it's usually always a load and go, in my opinion, unless you disagree, which I'm all for. Um, yeah. So with that being said, like, so it's focusing on the threat. What are some of the scenarios you're running kind of to emphasize that to drive that point home?
So here's an example. I think people understand what hot zones, warm zones, and cold zones are.
Hmm.
For an example, we'll set a scenario up, a hot zone scenario where we'll have somebody in a room with, some type of blanks or some type of simunition, and in the doorway we'll have a victim down, a
Hmm.
casualty down, and then we'll send the students in and see what they do. The correct answer is get the victim off the X if he has, let's say, a leg wound, and then address the threat almost simultaneously, and then render aid in that order. But you'd be surprised how people, don't do that. In the terms of warm zone, what's a warm zone? Like, you would think that if you have somebody blocked down in a single room and the hall behind you is warm, well, yeah, that might be. But what happens, for instance, an example, I was doing a training in a kind of an old out of service hospital, and I was part of the rescue task force, and we were treating some people with what we thought the warm zone was. We had protection to officers, and guess who comes down the elevator? Well, warms go to hot. And
Hmm.
so and so you can't slack off on that perception that if you are in a warm zone, you're safe. You're not entirely safe, but you take that risk because you need to render aid in an expeditious fashion in a timely fashion.
Right. And so for since we have a bunch of people who may not understand some terms, I'm going to explain. So the hot
Yeah.
zone, basically in the civil space, that is a threat is actively involved in there. If you go into the hot zone, the odds of you getting hurt or killed are significantly higher than they are anywhere else on the crisis side of the scene. Your warm zone, for us in the tactical emergency casualty care realm, we like to call that the indirect threat, or perhaps on the TC3 side, the tactical combat casualty care side, and like, hey, tactical field care maybe. But the thing with the warm zone is like it can go hot in a drop of a bucket, like you said, and then the cold zone, that's this place on scene that is essentially safe. Granted, anything can go hot in a moment depending on threat. And then Rescue Task Force, for those that are not familiar, the Rescue Task Force was created. I don't remember the backstory behind it, but essentially the job was to get non-law enforcement entities like your firefighter paramedics or EMS medics into the warm zone with protection, usually 2 to 4 officers, like law enforcement officers with guns, which, as you see, you pull 4 officers off to support one guy, and it gets a dynamic shift square. So, terms to explain there. Also, too, I want to mention, so Dr. Strauss, Mr. Paul Strauss, is an anesthesiologist. And so people associate with anesthesia, like, no, they're just the guys up in the OR putting people to sleep and dropping tubes down throats. Like, no, they're the we they are the resuscitation experts in medicine. So for those, just helping
We
explain
keep
terms.
people alive while surgeons fix the holes, whether they
Yes.
like to hear that or not.
Yeah.
That's the truth.
Well, and if you look at like kind of the model too, in a lot of countries, not everywhere has emergency medicine, and usually if they don't have emergency medicine physicians, the anesthetists are the one who do the initial resuscitation. Um,
Well, like the ABCs, or you want to call March, either airway breathing circulation or massive hemorrhage airway breathing. Who's those experts? It's us.
yeah.
We deal with airways all the time. We deal with putting tubes into how people breathe. We do fluid resuscitation. That it's like cooking. We do it with our hands.
Yes, sir. Yeah. And that's I like that you're taking all your in-hospital experience and then you're translating it in a manner um, for your traditional patrol officer to understand. That was one of my biggest lessons that I learned from like, hey, medical terminology is great and dandy for us in medicine, but like I literally had a patrol officer tell me one time, like, hey, what is hemorrhage? I'm like, touche, good sir, just lots of red.
Yeah. Well, here's something interesting. In doctor world, anesthesia world, we have all these kind of instruments and monitors and all that stuff. I'm old school. Whenever I'm teaching residents, I say, stop looking at the monitors, look at the patient. Because in the street, that's what you have. You don't have all these fancy gadgets. You don't. And there's so much information that you can get, the spidey sense that you develop by over time by looking at people. Well, you can see if they're exchanging air. You can see if they're mentation. That gets so much information, and on the street, that's as much valuable information as you need to tell you the status of somebody you're taking care of.
Right. Yeah. Like sick versus not sick. And it's one of those like, yeah, it's pretty easy to look at someone and say hey, they're sick. And to be honest, like I always like to empower because that's another thing that sort of frustrates me about medicine is we have this mentality like, oh, I need this medic, I need this doc. It's like, no, like the most important person in the chain of survival is the individual and the bystander. And
Yeah,
like,
well, I always say that what we do is in terms of street stuff, tactical medicine or rendering aid in the street. It's not rocket science, but people get bent all out of over the axle when they hear, "Oh, I'm doing medicine, I can't handle this." It's really not that difficult. I mean, in the conceptually, if it's bleeding, you stop the bleed.
right.
If you're not breathing, you help them breathe.
Hmm.
It's really that simple. And that's one of the things when I teach, I try to make it relate to that. And then obviously I have real world experience. I'll tell stories that, oh, now I get it. It's not, you have to make people comfortable in doing these skills, and they're not that complicated. Putting a tourniquet on is not that complicated. If
Right.
you understand the why of what you're doing, why are we putting it high and tight? Oh, now that I understand.
Yeah. Yeah. So with that, like, I'm a big proponent of getting people to understand the why. So like when you're teaching someone who doesn't really have any experience with, say, bleeding control, like what are some of your techniques that you use to emphasize why it's important?
Okay, well, first of all, putting a tourniquet on. Do you know why we put it so high? It's because we look at pulses either high in the groin or right under the armpit because the artery is superficial to the surface and behind it is this bone. So what you're doing is you're squishing the artery between the outside and the bone. Well,
Right.
doesn't that make sense? It's really simple.
Right.
And so now I gave this visual image of what you're trying to do with a tourniquet. Oh, okay, I can remember that.
Right. And that's, I think too, I like you said it right there. It's like, all right, if I am able to squish hose against hard, then I can stop bleeding. Like that to me is like if I empower people to understand the concepts behind it, then they can come up with their own solutions if they have to. Like, um,
Right. But I remember whether it was medical school or even during residence staff, during probation in Cop World, I was always asking the why because it's not if A happens, you do B because if there's a little B off to the side, it doesn't work. And that's how you have to start thinking. Why am I doing something so you can apply it to any general situation or problem?
right. That's another thing too. It's like from anesthesia, it's not just penetrating trauma that kills people. Like how many times have you had to do CPR or take an airway emergently? Like, um, so and that being said, like we like to hyper focus on the tactile medicine portion. Um, in your opinion, how important is it to focus on like the holistic, like the whole picture of medicine when it comes to acute sickness and injury in the field?
Do you mean the general health of people?
Well, no, not. I mean, like, so if you're a patrol officer getting dispatched to a call, like, so for instance, our primary airway problem these days, or respiration problem, like fentanyl overdose.
Okay.
Like recognizing that, like, I guess trying to phrase this in a manner that sounds intelligent. How much like when you're doing your classes, how much emphasis are you placing on recognition of what's killing that person?
Oh, really important. I mean, seriously, it's really simple. You could die from bleeding hemorrhage in 3 to 5 minutes. You could die from a hole in the chest in about 5 to 7 minutes, and anything else, you basically 10 to 20 minutes. So where their priorities are. And so, you've heard of the win, what's important now. So that really does apply in this stuff also. And again, you look at somebody, you will do kind of a sweep of the entire body. But if you have a pool of blood under somebody's leg, well, that's the money.
Right.
So it doesn't, and again, you take it out of the complexity of I'm doing some medical stuff and like, oh, there's this red puddle under there. That might be the problem.
Right. Yeah, and that's one thing I emphasize or try to emphasize in training. Like, hey, if you see any blood on the ground, assume it's massive hemorrhage until you can disprove that theory because like the clock is ticking.
Right.
And that's another thing that I've seen in hospital that annoys me. Not annoys me, it's the wrong term. Like, but like when you see a trauma bay with blood on the floor, it's like okay, like that's sloppy bleeding control, which we can't really afford to do in the field unless you work in a system that has the ability to put blood back into people.
Yeah, but well, so that's different though, because by the time they get to the hospital, they've been bleeding for a while. They might have gotten blood, but in turn, but here's the value of this of training. You take scenario training where you have one of these things that actually actively bleed, and then
Hmm.
you see this pumping and squirting. It's obviously a role player wearing this device, or you have this pool of fake blood under them. Well, most people have never seen that.
Right.
And now that you do this training in a safe environment, they see that they go, oh, this is significant. But if you just go to classrooms and practice putting tourniquets on each other, you don't get that same experience.
Right. And that's one thing too. Like, all right, what my favorite thing to ask students, like, all right, how do you know your tourniquet's effective? Like, oh, the pulse is gone too. Like, no, the bleeding has stopped. And unfortunately,
Yeah.
we like that's so that being said, like, what are you using for simulations to like, are you using wearables? Are you like, what are you
Yes.
doing to simulate
Yeah.
the
We
bleeding?
at one of the places I train is there's a $15 million simulation center. We have all the devices that actually these role players put on them, and they have little pumps that you squeeze and give blood. It is invaluable because I mean, how many people? What's I don't even know the number. What percentage of people have seen a significant leg bleed? I mean, in the hospital, I've seen it, right? But you're taking cops who've never seen this stuff, and you're asking them to treat it. Well, how about in training, showing them what it might look like?
Yes, 100%. Like that, and that's like even I would do so like to demonstrate the classes of shock. I would take 2 liters of blood and dump it on the ground. And be like, all right, if you see that much blood, like you're way behind the power curve.
Right,
And you know what the biggest takeaway for me from that experience is like I was expecting the puddle to be a lot bigger, and
right.
it wasn't that big.
But also, this stuff is sticky. It's smelly. You know, and all of a sudden, you come onto a scene where there's real blood is going to come out. It's like, oh, now I reckon, and then you can simulate that in a training environment. Oh, I know what that is, and I'm not going to freak out.
Right. Um, for your for when you're training bleeding control, like I in the military we prefer like we call it the crawl walk run. When you're putting people through initial training, how do you kind of like ramp up the complexity?
Okay, so first, what we usually do is okay. Let's put tourniquets on yourself, tourniquets on your partner. Putting a tourniquet on self aid is not always as easy as you think it is. And then you emphasize, okay, you've been bleeding for a minute, you're a little dizzy. You can't replicate that, but to have people put a tourniquet on their non-dominant eye and make sure they can't use their they're not, I mean, they're okay. Sorry. Let's say you have somebody put a tourniquet on their dominant arm and make sure they can't cheat and put it on and use their dominant arm, and they fumble.
Yeah.
Have them slide down and tell them, okay, put this tourniquet on your leg. And they take the tourniquet out. It's still wrapped in plastic because they never took it out of the plastic. And this is their kit. They're not going to make that mistake twice.
Right.
So that's the crawl. And then we have bleeding simulators. Like we have these things called packing cubes.
Hmm.
They're plastic things that you have a little tube at the bottom and blood comes out and they have to pack it. Or you can have just a fake leg that's bleeding. And then the final most complexity thing is where you have a room with a few victims with different injuries, a chest injury, a leg injury, and they're all screaming and yelling, and that blood's coming out, and you have somebody, I'm short of breath, I'm short of breath, and you have his girlfriend complaining that, hey, help him, help him, help him, and that's the highest level of stress and complexity. But you do this walk, crawl, run.
Yep. Yeah. I think that's like, and you're like, so how much time are you taking to do that ramp up, I guess? That's always one of those questions. Like when
Well,
I,
that's the problem. Like when you do an organized course, you basically can, I think the minimum is 2 12-hour days, if not more, because you need at least one full day of skills.
Mhm.
The problem is that certain entities in the country cut that down and take out some of the skills because, or they sacrifice the scenarios. You can't do that.
Right.
I think the minimum, and it's difficult, is at least a 1 12 a 14-hour day because you need at least, I hate to say it, 6 hours of scenarios because you want to do one or two or three, and it takes time to set up. It's an organizational. You have to be very organized in how you do it because you don't want downtime. So you need people helping you so you can kind of like while you're doing one thing, I'm doing something else. You want your students to rotate, but it's a challenge. It really is because asking somebody to take time off their busy schedule in cop world, for instance, of 2 days is really challenging.
Yeah, that was one thing I ran into. Like they were always th hungry for the knowledge and thirsty for it when they got in. Like, but you could tell like, oh, here I am doing this mandatory training again, which is also like I find that in cop world, not being a cop myself, like I disarming your student population to make him like, hey, this stuff's important. My favorite go-to is like, hey man, I don't give a shit if you pay attention to this, but you're just gonna screw your buddy.
But I think it's changed over the years.
Yeah.
I know in LAPD, people there's multiple stories of their buddy almost dying
Hmm.
because they got shot. So I think that's changed a lot. In addition, if they're coming to know I got to do this mandatory training, that's the instructor's responsibility to make it interesting and exciting.
Yep.
So that's the difference. And I have the advantage of real world experience.
Yeah.
I can tell lots of you have the experience, the real world experience. It is invaluable because people can go bullshit. Have you ever done this in the real world? They go, yeah, I have, guys.
Yeah, a lot.
Yeah,
Only about 30 plus years of experience in some of the most
or eight
trauma
years in
intense.
cop world. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
that's different. On the street, so it's different. Getting back to what you said before about people's habits, one of the things they always teach in most TAC med classes is that, okay, yes, we go and put the tourniquets on. Now we have to get them to a higher level of care, and we got to do drags and carries.
Hmm.
Yeah, I'm going to do a drag and a carry in a 300-pound guy because I will tell you, the patients I've seen over the years in the medical side of the world, everybody's fat.
Hmm.
And you're going to say to somebody, and look at some of your fellow officers or fellow military guys, you're screwed. Sorry, I'm not carrying you out.
Yep.
so,
And
so
that's too. It's like, all right, like part of, because to be honest, like that you can argue that, all right, well, threat comes in various forms, and blowing your back out is, yeah, well, it's not a life threat, it's kind of a livelihood threat. Um, but yeah, what does it look like to stay in play, and how does it like, what's your extra resource plan? Like that's another thing. Like we.
So here's the thing. So you talk about rescue task force, fire guys.
Hmm.
Yes, they have lots of tourniquets, they have lots of chest seals, but you know what their value is? They have these things called stretchers.
Hmm.
And in fact, I carry on my active shooter kit two, we call them quick litters. They're basically candles, canvas bags,
Yep.
canvas sheets with handles on them.
Yep.
Because if the fire guys, depending on your department, like smaller departments, they work together, they train together, they go out to dinner together, they trust each other. I will tell you, in LAPD and LAFD, I'm not so the guys that want to go, but defining that quote warm zone is not as easy as you think.
Right.
And so, how do you get somebody out? It's hard. It's really hard. And the other thing I wanted to say, if you don't train with your people in your other department, the fire guys and the police, when the real time comes and you've never really trained together, well, that's a really bad time for the first time to happen.
Right. And that's one thing. So like doing the work with the State Patrol SWAT team in Washington, like I have a stair chair, I got a Furno stretcher, I've got Talon 2 litters. I'm like, hey guys, we're gonna practice on the equipment because hey, guess what you can do is go out to that ambulance, take their stretcher and bring it with you. Like
Yeah.
granted they might not like you for doing that, but if you but like that's another thing is like I look at there was a great I think it was Santa Ana, like essentially we use it for patient evacuation and they ended up using like the little carts that people use in apartments for groceries as casevac
Uh huh.
vehicles. So they just put the kid in it, drag them out to the ambient, like to the cold zone, and like, hey, when you have wheels, use wheels. When you have like, if you have a way to carry them without using their body parts, use that. Like, so I actually found that taking a Mega Mover, the gigantic 13-handled EMS stretcher, a non-rigid stretcher, cutting in half, and then I'd have my entry guys, my SWAT, the traditional SWAT operator, slide it, fold it, and then slide it under their back panel. So if we have a casualty, the first person, obviously people are holding security, but the first person that steps over is going to pull it, drop it. They Whoever's responsible for Casevac grabs the patient, puts it on the Mega Mover. Two guys on both sides. They scoot out. We have a Talon 2, a rigid litter, like a traditional military litter at the first point that it makes sense. Onto the Talon 2. They drag them out to the armor, throw them in the armor. Doc's there. Doc makes a quick evaluation. Do we hold on the armor or do we need to move back to the CP and get them in an ALS rig? And the goal for
Right.
all that is throw an arbitrary number
Right.
out there.
But if you don't have stuff, gadgets, you just not. It's not going to happen.
Right.
I'm going to carry a 300-person down the stairwell on the
Mm-mm,
third three flights. No way.
mm-mm.
It's not going to happen. In fact, I did some emergency management training for a surgical center, and they had these rigid litters with four Filipino nurses, small ones that were not going. They could not get even a small person down the stairwell going around floor to floor. So they switched to one of these soft litters.
Yep.
But that's the real world, and
Yep.
unless you train and test it, it's the worst time to find out is an actual incident.
Yeah, no, that's one of those big things that you see so time and time again. And like it's not so much the treatment usually like all right, treatment's fine, but like it comes to the operational nuances of how do you actually move this person that we see the biggest failure points. Um, you talked about you do executive protection training, is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
Well, I
So
do the medical side of it. Yes.
okay. So that the EP world's like executive protection, like that's an interesting world because their job, it's not like law enforcement where you're there for the citizenry. You're there for usually a single person and or their family.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, so working in that realm, like so you're well, you're in like multiple worlds. You're in traditional medicine, cop world, and now EP world. What are some of the differences between cop world and EP world that you emphasize in your training?
Okay. So in cop world, we are stopping a threat to the general public. That's our priority, stopping the killing. Then stopping the dying is a secondary. And everybody is essentially equal. Well, they're prioritized by their actual injury, but they're essentially equal. No one's kind of one over the other. Essentially, you're making a very rational decision on the severity of each injury, and you prioritizing that way. In EP world, everybody else is no. You could
Right.
the guy who's paying your salary is who's protected, and unless he says releases you and say go back and help other people or get my family out, it's very very different. It
Yeah.
really is. And
And that
so I was gonna say, who do you hazard? Cops hazard themselves for the general public. EP people will only hazard themselves for their protectee
right,
only.
which is it's an interesting concept because they're like it, it there's lots of emphasis on get the heck out of Dodge more than
There
like
is, you're right,
so
because you only have one person.
right. I guess that also opens up the door too. So in your executive protection training, do you open up the kind of the like going into the layer of like moral injury is one of my like favorite things to focus on. Like, do you talk about moral injury at all with like the EP guy, executive protection guys? Because hey, you may have to abandon other people who in pain and suffering for what you're there to do.
Well, we go through the conversation of what are you willing to hazard yourself for, where your priorities are.
Right.
For instance, as a cop, we take people into custody, right?
Hmm.
If I'm off duty or you're a civilian with a CCW, your priority is self-defense for you and your loved ones.
Hmm.
If you choose to stop the threat, that's because you morally want to do that. But isn't your priority in like a civilian world active shooter to protect you and your loved ones?
Right.
And it can be different. So it's the same thing. And so it's always interesting to have the conversation beforehand so you get people thinking about it. So God, because if all of a sudden you got involved in it and you never thought about it, what are you going to do?
Right.
That's the
And I think that's one thing too that I like to talk about mental rehearsals, like
yeah.
dry fire. Like I can dry fire all day long without a gun and still get a decent rehearsal in. So in your training, like, do you talk about that? Like having people do the kind of like the mental rehearsal. Hey, rehearse a scenario in your mind right now and think about what you would do.
Of course. Well, here's the other interesting thing. And I guess this leads into it, command and control.
Hmm.
Like if you got a team working, who's in charge? Because if no one, and this is the mental rehearsal, like depending on, and that, as I've kind of developed my training, my teaching techniques, I'll tell if I'm working with a group of students and we're sending them into a scenario, whether it's an active shooter or whether it's an EP, who's in charge. You need to know that beforehand because you need to assign roles.
Right.
And and if you don't rehearse that beforehand, have a plan, because if I don't do that, what happens? I'll take some new guys, and you'll have five victims, five responders, and everybody's working on the individual responders. And then when we have our quote ambulance come, he'll say, "Okay, what do you have? Who goes first?" No one knows
Right.
because everybody's head's buried in their individual. So unless you practice that and talk about command and control and this mental health rehearsal beforehand, just like a football game,
Yep.
you know the play.
Yep.
You have to do that beforehand.
Right. Watching tape. That's like actually the concept of watching tape. I spent a lot of time analyzing body cam footage on just ways that I can refine my teaching process to help minimize kind of some of the mistakes. I use that heavily because I'm not in the situation with the adrenaline. But the observations I see that could be done better. I completely lost my train of thought on what I was going to talk about. So yeah, mental rehearsals. That being said, like, so this is something that I've recognized. Do you ever talk about with your students, hey, this is what it feels like to get shot?
Um, I've seen. Well, it's interesting because you can't actually simulate that, but when you use simulations, that's the next level uh, of training, and like people actually get shot.
Right.
So yeah, but it's interesting because there's something called fibs, and I don't know how can I say this. F I've been shot at and F I've been shot. That you can look at body cam videos of people. There are three ways to somebody stop a threat: physical, or physical, or they give up emotionally, or just psychological. They think they've been shot.
Right.
So that's a very important thing, and that's just personality. That's stress inoculation. Um, and it's just again the only way to kind of work through that is uh, through scenario training. You
Yeah.
know,
Well,
so maybe not getting. You're talking about if you're talking about stress as opposed to being shot. There's a it's kind of the same but different. It's like you're screaming and yelling at people if hey, why you do you need to induce stress, which is kind of like I guess what you're thinking about. Is that what you're trying to describe?
well, sort of. It's more of like along the lines of like the number of times I've talked to guys, worked with guys, like I've had friends who've gotten shot in their sabby plates, and they thought they were tripping. Like the self-awareness, because hey, you don't always realize like I need to initiate self-aid. I need to start treating myself. Like the buddy checks, okay, we have shots fired. What does every team do? All right, check your buddy to your left and right, because it's relatively darkly comical how many people don't realize they've actually been shot.
Well, we see this all the time in the hospital. Literally all the time, I've been shot. And they come in, I'm not feeling good. It's all, yeah, what happened? Yeah, somebody was shooting some guns off somewhere. I mean, literally, because look, theoretically, if you get shot in the head, you're probably out like a light. If
Yes.
you get shot in the chest, it takes a couple of minutes for you to die if you're going to die. But I will tell you, if you get shot in one lung, it's 25% chance of dying. If you have shot in two lungs, it's 85% chance of dying. But you might not know you're shot in one side.
Right.
And getting shot in the belly, I can't tell you how many times I've seen somebody come into, yeah, somebody shot me in the belly, and they only realized afterwards, and they have a hole in the gut, but they don't know. They
Yeah.
only know afterwards.
Yeah. That's always kind of my thing with like if you hear the pop 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 and do a quick check on yourself, like at the very least the junctions, like that's another emphasis. Like I really try to hammer home is like our strap tourniquets are great, but they don't really stop the sites that I'm truly scared about. Like obviously the pelvis hiding. I've had way too many casualties with GSWs hiding in the pelvis that we got lucky. But yeah, you bring up a valid point that I also think that is important to emphasize, that like the human body can take a lot of abuse, and like recognizing what the true life threats are, and then taking the relatively simple actions to stopgap them are the hardest, seems to be the hardest thing to drill home to people.
Well, two things. Okay, so let's say somebody is shooting. We had a call where somebody makes a phone call that, hey, I've been shot. Can you pick me up and take me to the hospital? He had a through and through skull shot into his back of his head from his tendon. So he had a wherewithal of calling his friend on his phone and saying, I've been shot. We already assumed that, hey, if I give you a headshot, you're dead, like turning a light switch off. It's not true. I've had the call where somebody came into the hospital with a hole in their heart. The sac around the heart stopped the bleeding temporarily, and we sewed the hole up. He lived.
Yep.
Now it's not rare. I wouldn't bet my money on it, but no guarantees in life.
Yeah, no, that's and those are the valuable stories that you bring to the like that and that same thing. Like I have all of my mistakes I've made. I like to air my dirty laundry, that way people can learn from them. And mainly it's missing wounds. That being said, like how often during training are you kind of like um, giving, not necessarily like the hard, like I don't like to call them hard wounds, but like giving the training pattern, like the wound patterns that emphasize the importance of not doing crappy assessment.
Well, example, the one you're talking about is a chest wound that has a hole in the front and a hole in the back, right? So you'll have your role players. I'm short of breath, pretending his role is short of breath. Clear wound on his chest. He's lying face up, and they'll put a chest wound in, and he's not getting better, or he gets a little better, not too much, and then he gets really bad, and they never turn him over the back and check the back. That's the traditional one that you're talking about.
Yeah.
That's really, yeah. So, and you got to, in the hospital, you talk about trauma naked, where we take everybody's clothes off. Now, you don't want to do that so much in the field because you don't want to get somebody cold,
Right.
but you got to do a complete assessment. You'll miss stuff.
Right. That's also, so one of the, I guess I'm gonna ask you an opinion about something. All right. So if you're not the first initial responder, but say you're working a casualty collection point, you have someone brought to you, and they have a nice high and tight tourniquet, but that tourniquet's on clothing. Does that make your spidey sense tingle at all? Since it's like, okay, high and tight on clothing.
Depends on, I would look at if they're bleeding or not. That's the problem. I would not want to necessarily take it off, but I would cut the clothing off below it to make sure they stop bleeding. Because
Yeah,
the problem is that uh, even if you get the bleeding stopped 95%, you still, if that little trickle long term, your clotting factors, your body thinks I need to use up my clotting factors,
yeah,
and that's a whole nother problem later on. So if you put a tourniquet on, you got to make sure it's 100% tight, not just the almost tight.
right.
You got to stop that bleeding complete. So the only way to do that is to really look at where the entrance to the wound is, and if you need to put a second tourniquet on, go ahead.
Right. Yeah, yeah. So one of the things I like to teach, especially medics, not so much cops, because like they do hasty tourniquets, but for me, for medics, like I tell them, like, hey, if you see a tourniquet on clothing, assume that they didn't do a good assessment. You need to cut away as quickly as possible to make sure you're
Yeah,
not missing any holes.
yeah,
Because like that's a big one for me. I've had this bite me routinely. I hate to use that term routinely, but it's happened a lot. We're like, all right, tourniquets are applied, but the actual wound is up too high for a tourniquet, and we just got lucky that someone recognized it eventually and like stopgapped it. Because that's another thing too that like, I truly have tried to emphasize in training that like your true massive bleeding sites are going to be somewhere that you may not even recognize. Because to be fair, like if I get shot in the pelvis and my common iliac is shredded, like most of that blood's getting contained in the pelvis.
it's on the inside. I know.
Yeah.
Uh, and the problem is, you've got somebody who has let's say, a pool of blood underneath them, and their jeans are soaked. You have no clue where the initial injury is. You don't.
Hmm.
It could be anywhere.
Yep. Are you teaching? So like this is one thing I also discovered working in cop world was like, hey, cops are already conditioned to do a phenomenal blood sweep. It's called a pat down. And to be honest, in my opinion, like the way the pat down works where you start at the belt line, like you're actually doing a more effective blood sweep than like starting head to toe. Because like, all right, if I do a sweep in the pelvis, I feel warm and wet. Like I teach them, hey, go ahead and shut down the aorta through the belly button if you can, at least stopgap it to figure out where that bleed is coming from. Along those lines, like how much emphasis are you doing on direct pressure and pressure point control
So,
as an adjunct?
so I think, go back to cop world is different military. Cops get shot, their buddies next to them. Usually, you usually know where you've been shot.
Hmm.
I would say, it could be the chest might be different, but if you're going to shot in the leg or the arm, it's I'm shot in the leg, I'm shot in the arm. So it's a little bit different. And I don't think, and cops tend to just put the tourniquet on the most obvious bleeding site. There's tons of videos out there, and all the video body worn video libraries. I don't really see them doing sweeps very often,
Yeah.
and because it's different. It really is different.
Right. And I think that's one of the things like I try to emphasize the importance of like, hey, get a good initial assessment because like bullets, well, penetrating trauma does weird. So even like we were talking about bladed weapons at the beginning, like it, trauma's weird. Like if I especially if I'm using high energy projectiles, like they'll hit, bounce, ricochet, go all over the place. Like getting people conditioned to recognize like, okay, just because the obvious thing has been treated, like let's just do a discount double check to make sure we didn't miss anything else that's going to bite us in the butt later.
But also, I think military versus cop world. Cops, oh, I'm bleeding. I'm gonna put a tourniquet on. Hey, fire guys, would you check this guy out? Because now you have the paramedics coming in, and
Right.
that's what they do on a day in, day out. So it's different. You're not in some far remote location. Look, in most urban environments, you'll be on an operating table within 1 hour
Right.
of an injury. So it's different. So it's interesting how TCC, the military side, is different from the TECC or whatever is cop side. It's
Yeah.
different because of it's different.
Yeah, no, it's you're hitting on. I can't remember if we already talked about it or if it was before we started recording. Like, yeah, the difference between the operational concepts are very different. Is the clinical medicine similar? Yes, but the operational operating picture is significantly different. And
Yeah,
like that's I always get like it's a low key pet peeve of mine when people do tactical combat care training in the United States for people who are not going to combat.
It's different because you have, and the scenarios that you train with have to be different too.
Right.
Like for instance, I've done Air Force guys, and we'll load like 4 or 5 role players the back of a pickup truck and dump them off. And and after they're in the classroom, all of a sudden we dump them off. Going, hey, there's a bomb blast, and okay, deal with these like 5 guys at a pickup truck. It's different. It's very different.
Right. Well, and the ironic thing too about the military is like even TC3, the Tactical Combat Casualty Care Protocols, like it applies in a very unique operational environment. Like we still have a significant amount of training injuries, like accidents and all this stuff that still like if
Right.
you apply TC3 protocols, like might not be the best course of action because
It's a boo boo.
yeah.
It's not a goddamn. It's not a gunshot wound. It's
Yeah,
just a goddamn boo boo.
yeah,
You
exactly.
know.
Yeah, that so like as a young medic, like you want to know what the most like you know what you go through the most as a medic? Freaking band-aids. You know what you
Yeah.
don't you know what you don't
Yeah.
carry when you're a new medic? Band-aids. Then if suddenly
Yeah.
you're like, oh man, I should probably carry band-aids. Band-aids, Tylenol, and like I made a joke to a buddy. It's like simple wound care has probably saved so many more lives than tourniquets ever have.
So it's funny when I first started as a cop, going out with the full time guys. They always wanted to go out with me because they knew I had this trauma bag. And all of a sudden, we go to trainings. Hey, do you have a band aid?
Yeah.
So I have a goddamn separate boo boo pack.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just like freaking the most important medicine to carry on an operation is Imodium because
Yeah.
you know it doesn't stop shit. So I'm gonna change tracks completely here. We talked about like so one of the pictures you sent to us is
Can you show it? Can you put it up?
we're I'm not that quick.
Okay.
I'll paint the picture and it's gonna go out on all the socials. But like so it's you in front of the Eiffel Tower during the Paris Olympics in your full LAPD uniform with a marked rig from LAPD, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we one of our reserves is well connected into the French government. I
Okay.
had the privilege of going out to France, 30 of us, 30 LAPD reserves, about a half a dozen or a dozen sheriffs to be at the Olympics. We were the only entity allowed to carry a firearm other than the French because we had people after us.
Okay.
Seriously, Americans, they don't like, there was people who did not want us around. So
Huh.
we carried on, but for 99% of it was shaking hands and smoozing and stuff like that. However, we got a very good insight and preparation of what it's going to be like in Los Angeles in 28. It really was. By the way, those cars that you see, there is a group of enthusiasts who have replica cars. They're not real cars, by the way, but
Oh,
they're pretty
okay.
good. Yeah,
Okay.
they're the problem is they wanted to make them realistic. They should have used a lot more duct tape on the inside.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's a Crown Vic. I was like, oh, we're going old school here. No, that was just cool, and like, yeah, we'll make sure it goes out. That being said, like, so I've done a lot of looking into how the French ran the security protocols for the Olympics, and to be honest, like, it made me super jealous because looking at the World Cup coming out to the United States, like, when I realized like between the Grande Armée and the National Police Nationale, or I can't pronounce French these days, I apologize to my French Canadian friends. Like they were able to redeploy or deploy 40,000 officers.
Yeah. So here's the thing: they had 35 to 40,000 officers there
That's insane.
every day,
That's insane.
except they had more the first day. Um, we were assigned one like squad every day. There was nothing to do because you couldn't blink without finding an officer. Now here's the difference between that and what's going to happen in 28. The French police agency, basically France is one big police force.
Yep.
And then let's say Paris is what we call a bureau.
Hmm.
And then you have stations, which would be, say, divisions, but they all follow the same rules.
Yep.
We have 5,000 worker bees in LAPD, if that much, maybe another 5,000 sheriff and worker bees and sheriffs. Where are we going to get all these other people?
Yeah.
You can imagine a Texas Ranger coming to do Texas Ranger and they get a snowflake from Beverly Hills. Seriously.
Yeah.
And that's going to be a problem.
That's some of the stuff like I've been connected with some of the planning for the World Cup in Seattle and like when I look at the French model, there's a couple other like the Korean civil defense, like the police and fire are all fully nationalized. And like when I look at the US and our 16,000 different law enforcement agencies that all do things ever so slightly different, and oh, by the way, none of their radios work together, it
Oh,
makes me chuckle.
it's not, but it's not funny.
No, it's not. It's
So,
terrible.
so
It's
I was,
terrible.
I worked I worked the Palisade Fires.
Mm,
And so we had National Guard there.
hmm.
They were there. You know what their role was? To put their big trucks in front of the road so you couldn't get past it. The National Guard for the Olympics is going to be used at the checkpoints. My concern is that they do, and the biggest threat is a terrorist threat, right? Obviously, it's not like they were here also for the riots. Actually, they're here now for our riots,
Right.
but they're there for crowd control.
Yep.
Very different problem is going to be during the Olympics.
Yeah.
Are they trained enough to deal with an active situation?
Right.
I don't know. It's going to be it'll be interesting. They're supposed to be assigned to all the checkpoints, like to get into different venues. The other thing is going to be the traffic situation. Paris is great in terms of their subway system. It's great. You go your phone. I want to go to the Louvre. You go here. They said, okay, walk 100 feet, get onto the train station, take blah blah blah, 5 stops. That doesn't happen. It's not going to happen in Los Angeles. My understanding is the plan is to close one lane. Well, okay, the Olympic Village is going to be UCLA.
Okay.
The Media Village is USC. There'll be one lane closed on the 405, or one lane each way on the 10, and we're going to have buses. But and there's going to be no parking at the venue supposedly at this point. It's my understanding. I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but we're a car culture.
Right.
You're going to tell people you got to take a bus with all the homeless people are sleeping? No, we're not doing that.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. It's definitely I worked a V POTUS detail, not like I was part of the advanced party in Korea when the Olympics were out there, the Winter Olympics. So I got to see kind of the how they did stuff. And again, yeah, like it's all trains and then mass transit there, but like that doesn't work in America. So it'll be interesting. Good luck down there.
The other interesting is my understanding is that the local authorities and the IOC and the federal agencies are all kind of jockeying who's in charge.
That's a point I'm going to circle back to because you talked about during the your individual training, like, hey, someone needs to be in charge, like command and control, like that is it is one of the most frustrating aspects I see about the US civil space is the complete lack of who's in charge.
In terms of what, like an incident or something?
Like, so the actual incident response, like there's like, okay, I do have my undergrad is in disaster management, so like very well
Okay.
versed in the incident command system.
Unified command and stuff
Yep.
like that, right?
But like before an incident, like we're talking right now, like just like you said, like, hey, yeah, is it the feds? Is it the state? Like who's in charge? And like and to be fair, like California, like for the Olympics, you guys will probably be a little bit better set. Like unfortunately with fires, like the unified command that you guys have for your fire response has set you up fairly well for at least the interagency.
Yeah, it did. I worked the command center a lot for the fires, and people got to know each other.
Yep.
You don't know how valuable that is.
It's
just to
insane.
get to know. Hey, Joe, I need a favor. Okay, I trust you. What do you need?
Right. Yeah, actually, I had a few friends who were flying the air attack on that fire, and it's just like kind of crazy to hear the stories about what like they were seeing and all that. And hopefully the recovery is going well, and that everybody who lost stuff is on the mend. Yeah. So like, what even on like the microcosm of like, hey, like that first sergeant in, like, or well, one of the things too that I emphasize, like I've run a few active shooter training scenarios, like, hey, the first officer on, like, emphasizing like you're the on-scene commander until proven otherwise.
Yeah, so that's it, and it's all about personalities,
Yeah.
right? Like in Hollywood Division where I patrol, we're gonna have 50 people show up the first 2 minutes, and somebody's got to say, "I'm in charge." And there's usually an inside person in charge and an outside person in charge, and they need to communicate.
Yes.
And hopefully the radios work, because a lot of times they don't. You have to have runners going back and forth. But that's also about personalities.
Yeah.
And the person in charge needs to know what they're doing.
And
so that's the problem. There's usually a room boss, a hall boss, a staging boss, and they got to all work together. And that's what training's all about in a large scale incident training.
Right.
You need to do that stuff.
Yeah, and we brought it, like we talked about Uvalde briefly on the before the pre-interview. Like, yeah, you look at what happened in Uvalde, it was a failure of command and control. Like no one took charge and said, "Hey, go." And because I watched the body cam footage from the school shooting in Nashville that went down, and if you watch that footage, the reason why that went the way it did was you had two Nashville Metro SWAT officers who were on patrol that day, who then basically were like physically pushing the other patrol to keep driving forward.
Right. They knew what they were doing, and they took command, and it was successful.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
And
that
now, but now extend that to the next phase of stopping the dying.
right.
Same problem.
Yep.
And unless you practice that with your fellow civil service, you don't know what's going to happen.
Right. And I think that's the hard part to do because as you mentioned on the front end, like getting the time to train is
Yeah,
hard, but then two, you brought up a valuable point that we just glossed over. Like it is really hard to set up good training.
it is.
It
I
is.
mean, it's because okay, getting somebody to have a 1 day commitment is reasonable. Getting them to have a 2 day commitment in cop world is just not going to happen.
Yeah. Well, then too, like the large incident scenario training, like I've run quite a few exercises where like, hey, you get as much participation as you can, but the fun fact about this stuff is very rarely are the people, the decision makers actually involved in the training. They're usually running the training or they're managing the road while the other guys are doing the training. So like when the actual incident goes down, that sergeant, the lieutenant, the battalion chief, the captain off the engine company for the fire service, like they are now injecting themselves, but they haven't also like the last time they did this, they were behind the clipboard for the training event.
Yeah, but here's the interesting thing. So active shooters or hostage, their patrol level functions until they're not.
Right.
And a good leader, like I just came back from the active shooter assailant conference, and some of the debriefs, one of them particularly that I thought some higher level fire chief came and you had like a lieutenant running the show, and the lieutenant was about to pass off command to the deputy chief, and he says, no, it's your job. You're doing
Right.
a great job. And so that is egos or whatever. That's important.
That
So I think it's more important to get to train the patrol level people and have the command staff acknowledge if they're doing a good job, let them do it.
Yeah, I think that's the super valuable point. Like when yeah, like if your ground level tactical leadership are doing good and the strategic guys show up, like let them roll. Like all right,
Yeah,
cool, Roger that. Like I'll go. Like, do we need to set up a true incident command post? Like, all right, well we'll get that set up and we'll like because like, yeah, I think that's the thing with like too with the disaster cycle that we tend to forget. Like response is like yes, response is sexy and we get lots of pictures, but like it's this tiny little iota of the actual event. Like how do we set conditions to ensure that we're back to operations normal as quick as possible has always been my mantra when I'm doing ICS training for people. Like particularly, like I do school consulting work. I'm like, hey,
right.
for the executive staff of the school, I'm like, no, you own the entire incident. Like, yes, professional responders may come in to assist for part of it, but at the end of the day, they're gonna finish the mop up of the immediate stuff, but then you have the long term recovery and recycling back into the mitigation preparedness side of things.
Yeah, if you can train your patrol level people, the incident command side, and they understand it, so they're there first. It'll go so much smoother because they're there,
Right.
and all of a sudden they're establishing command and control. They're getting the functions working forward, and by the time the big command staff, it should be over.
Right.
Technically, you should have all victims out of an active shooter in 12 minutes. You know that
Yes.
technically,
Hmm.
12 minutes. The guys coming from downtown are not going to be there for an hour.
Right. Yeah, they're going to be doing all the they'll get all the credit, but they
Well, range of the media, reintegration with families,
right.
but the real two major, stopping the dying and stopping the killing, stopping the dying. The people who are on the ground, those patrol level people, should be learn all that stuff more than just putting on tourniquets.
Right.
They need to learn that command and control stuff.
Yep. Like you look at that from what was the event that just happened? Oh yeah, the attack in Boulder, Colorado, where the guy
Yeah,
was using a flamethrower and he
yeah,
wasn't on scene. Like, hey, like, oh, the Boston Bombers, another good one when they were doing the HRT manhunt for the kids. Like, hey, the we don't have a suspect in custody. Like, because now like that's another thing. Our initial scene management, but then quickly like, hey, we need to go into law enforcement investigative like time sensitive investigative stuff. Like we need to start pulling camera footage. We need to find this guy as quick as
right.
possible because they're still out there.
But that's phase two.
Right.
You now you essentially stop the dying. You don't want any more dying.
Right.
But at that point, you got over that. You got over that hurdle.
Yep. No,
Yeah.
that's the hard thing. Is like and teaching people how to be yeah, the time sensitive critical thinking is one of the hardest things to get people to learn. And I
You
think
can't teach people there, and you should take advantage of the people who have that innate skill.
yes. Yeah,
And so you have a group of 30 students. You only a certain proportion of those will have that innate skill. And if the real incident happens to have, you've given them permission to take charge
Yep.
by having your training.
That's beautiful right there. All right, Paul. Well, we are rolling up towards the end of this episode. So with about 5 minutes or so left, if you got any closing thoughts or comments that you'd like to kick out there for the general listening public.
No, I mean, so I do TACMED training. I started this company. I just got it post certified. I do it because I have a love for it and I think of the importance for it. Anybody out there, if you have this project of wanting to get into this world, one, please contact me. I would love to help people. It's not out of the goodness of my heart, but I really think it's important to save lives as an altruistic thing. But don't be afraid to start. The things I'm getting involved with, for instance, they're like I don't want to mention it now, but there are things I'm getting involved with what I would never thought I'd have an opportunity on a state level, a federal level.
Mm-hmm.
Who knows where it's going to go? But unless you start that small little process, it'll never happen. And this is important stuff. You are affecting people's lives.
Right. Well, I definitely appreciate you taking the time and pushing some of the lessons learned, and also thank you for all that you're doing, because not only are you saving lives in hospital, you're saving lives on the street, and you're also helping a agency adopt a culture of a realistic expectations to stop the dying and save the living.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. I also thank you for taking the time to share the stories about your worldly travels, and that's pretty awesome. And best of luck to you down there in LA for in 2028. We get a practice run for the World Cups, and we'll get some validation
Definitely.
there. Hopefully, everything will be fine. That's why we do
Yeah.
that's why we do mitigation work. We heavy mitigation is my watchword.
Yep. Definitely.
All right, Paul. Well, thanks again. And again, Splints and Whiskey is brought to you by Life Autonomous Care Consultants. Again, look up laccinc.com if you need any medical supplies or simulations. Again, laccinc.com, Life Autonomous Care Consultants.
Can I push my website?
Yes, sir. Go for it.
TACMEDUSA.com.
Yep. And so if you want to get in touch with Paul or see what he's doing, tacmedusa.com. We'll also throw it in the end of this episode, and it's going on all the socials. Again, Paul Strauss, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Paul Strauss, Officer Strauss. What other titles can we? World Traveler, Sir Strauss.
I tell you, all the cops wants me to save their lives if they got shot. All the doctors in the hospital want me to get them out of traffic tickets.
Of course, yeah, that's priorities. All right, Paul. Well, thanks again. We appreciate it, and we will see you soon.
Okay, thank you.